Hi, good evening everybody. It's a great pleasure to be with you here tonight and to share some thoughts. And Chiara asked me to give a brief introduction to a discussion about the theme of rules. In fact, I ain't no lawyer and I'm no expert in law, but I'm curious about it. And as any planner and practitioner, I stumble often into the subtleties of law, and I get my project either refused or rejected or changed due to some rules. So I started before as a practitioner and only then as a researcher to question what kind of rules are we using in city making and how rules to affect city making. Because I have the impression, more and more, a growing impression, that the rules we are playing with no longer correspond to the needs of this society. So this is a long dispute. You can date it back to the Gospel when Christ is healing on Saturday and the Pharisees are saying you should not make that because it's forbidden. And he answers, is this the law for the life of the life or the life for the law? Who is before? There is a long tradition in juridical debate about this prevalence of the principles of right or prevalence of what society and cities and individuals and communities produce constantly as experiments in their daily activity, politically, civically, economically, and how this should be incorporated into law. So if law can be transformed by life, it's not simply a spiritual question, but it's really a practical question. So when somebody is throwing law against me to say that something cannot be done, and let's make a typical and very clear example, if somebody occupies an unused space, which is private property, or even it's state property, is this right or is this wrong? Legally, it is right. But everybody of us, since a very long time in history, we are all being convinced that unused goods are available for other uses. And there is a tradition in legal debate in which absentee proprietorship can be expropriated, in which people can farm unused land. This dates back to disputes that date as back as the 15th century or the 14th century in Europe. Although this never became a majority principle and was never incorporated in law, although in some cases we accept in exceptional occasions that private property, for instance, can be taken not only by the state but also from collectivities, and this has never become a part of our legal system. And when we look at the system of rules that are incorporated in city making, there is a kind of archaeology of those rules. We tend to see them as a single body. And when somebody denies permission or forbids a civic action, which is rather frequently the case in the daily administration of city, it seems to me sometimes that the main goal of cities is to preserve the status quo and to avoid the absurgency of new forms of city making, which should be, on the contrary, one of the missions of the cities. The former deputy mayor to planning of Barcelona, philosopher Jordi Borja, in a wonderful book that unfortunately I don't think was translated in English, it's about the public space, was proposing to have a third intermediate category between legal and illegal behavior, which is the typical distinction we make, and saying that cities should cultivate an illegal space in which experiments can be made to be decided only by judging effectiveness and desirability of results, whether one behavior should fall then within illegal behavior or legal behavior. Occupations are illegal behavior, but in many cities in Europe and in the US especially, but now also in China, they start to be necessary ingredients in the variety of city life and in the ways we can make city. Also because market, for instance, seems to fail. In non-central places, and I mean by central cities like London, parts of Paris in Europe, parts of Milan maybe, real estate market fell so low that you hardly can imagine any investment in major projects in the coming 5 to 10 years. And so either we choose that we stick to the rules and we kill any possibility of initiative, or we experiment other ways. We lose the rules. So why did we get to this? Because we have made a single package of rules that were in history layered in different times, and we tend to apply them regardless of their original purpose. So we have, for instance, let's go like in an archaeology from the most recent to the deepest level. The most recent level is all the rules that we made to adapt to the regulatory planning of the 60s and 50s to new necessities. In fact, no European country has made a thorough and complete reform of its planning code to accept new facts that were happening in cities. For instance, to accept the fact that the planning systems in Europe were mostly designed in post-war Europe, when the main problem was to rule the growth of the city, the expansion. So it's about making new things and redistributing wealth, right, and power that are generated when I begin making new parts of the city. So I create new value, for instance. I should take one slice of this value to make schools, to make roads, to pay back for services, or things like that. This is a typical, it's 80% of our ruling system, which is not the case. And those rules, when applied to reuse, for instance, which is the main problem in our city, but I think also in your cities, reuse do not work anymore. For instance, I apply what is called a double taxation. Double taxation is illegal in financial law because you have been taxed at the origin when you were developing that property in 1930s to make it a factory, and you are re-taxed now that you redeveloped, which makes in Torino, in Italy, more costly reuse than greenfield development. So we have a public policy that should encourage reuse and not greenfield development, but the result when you apply for a planning permission is that it is much more costly for you to reuse than to develop greenfield. So we never made that adaptation. We have rules of planning that are based on zoning and were laid for a developing city. We have another layer of rules that we never reformed. It's the rules laid down between 1870 and 1930, and those rules are the rules of codes, which are much more interesting because they define the form of objects, how big should be a window, how tall should be a building, how wide should be a street. And usually modernist planning was not very interested in those issues, but those are very relevant issues, and we should adapt them to new social needs. I make an examples. For instance, the goal of defining in a percentage of glassed surface in facade originally was to allow a good quality of internal lighting, a sufficient quality of ventilation. But we have new systems to make that, and some possibilities are not possible, cannot be applied, or you can apply them, but you're still obliged to comply to the old rules. So this is a layer of what is called in jargon coding urbanism, which is not the planning and the zoning urbanism, that has become very old, and we have no longer been interested, but is growingly dominating. Why? Because when you go to reuse, those rules in most cases are much more strict and complicated to use than the rules of planning and of zoning, which in reuse usually you can take them for, you can change them relatively easy because you work in the existing city, so you have lower expectancies on the changes that could be introduced by new functions. And then we have an even deeper layer of rules that date back to the 17th and early 18th century, which are defining the private property and the individual rights instead. The correspondence of the individual rights in city making is private property, and which are very, very tough and difficult. So currently in Torino, most of the legal dispute about planning is no longer about zoning attribution, but is having quarrels between two private people about the change of a property right. Somebody opening a window looking on my property. This is a typical 17th, 18th century question that has become again very, very important. In reuse, you have already city, and this city has been stratifying rights, okay? And then we have an even older and very interesting at this moment layer of rules, which it should sometime go back, which are the Middle Ages rules, that were very interesting. Why? Because in Middle Ages there was no legal conception of the fact that the state was the most important authority. State was one of the authorities in society, was the most power, could be the most brutal. The king could be very brutal, but was not the unique authority. This was the church. There were the corporations, there were a lot of intermediate legal bodies that were making rules or making particular specific rules. And this is very similar to our current situation, in which we have different bodies that practice city making. Not only state is producing the city, not only the mayor is producing the city, society is producing much more city than City Hall does, at least after the crisis, even more than real estate developers and typically formalized subjects. So this brings us back, for instance, to a very interesting debate about the commons. I think Laura will speak about that bring a completely different legal tradition to our attention, which is not based on the distinction between individual, state, public, and private. There is a kind of third zone, you will, I think, talk about that, in which a community can express a form of communal property or communal use. And many cities are trying to incorporate this in planning, but in my experience, this incorporation stumbles against the rules of old planning and the rules of property organization that are still incorporated in very important laws like the civil code or the fiscal codes that regulate the economic transaction between individual and states. So we have a great work of reforming in this. And then the even older layers, but this is all only for the Latin countries, in which we go back to the Roman idea of what is property, which is a very, very strong idea that doesn't separate the different aspects of property, and therefore is one of the toughest. It's much more tougher than the idea of property than the Anglo-Saxons have, which is much more based on negotiation. Why am I saying this? Because we have this bundle of different regulation that tend to be assumed as a single and organic body, but no longer are. And I have the impression that in unbundling this bundle of laws, we can multiply and open new possibilities for the cities, in the individuals, the intermediate bodies, the association, the civic groups, the community, to produce space in new and creative ways, and we can eventually recognize the experiments that society naturally does and is making more and more during the crisis, fortunately, because individual and groups do not cease to be creative and committed to public good, even if there is crisis. And we can make this more powerful and incorporate it into the planning dispositives and devices and then into legislation. Remembering that distinction by Jordi Borgia, in allowing this a legal space, we can produce new ideas and new possibilities of action that could be afterwards being incorporated even into formal planning and into legislation. Unfortunately, at this moment, this bundle of rules tend more to prevent or discourage citizens to take actions than to stimulate them in doing that. Thank you.